Hey guys, it's Tom, and we're going to build now upon what we were discussing so far with reference to existentialism as an orientation that emphasizes the dimension of freedom exercised against the background awareness of our finitude, perhaps most premierly expressed in the case of death or mortality, but not only that, also in terms of other limitations, biological, cultural, social, and so forth, limitations which in toto we might designate as the terms of facticity in which we are operating. Now, oftentimes a plaint raised against this existentialist orientation is that, and we sort of alluded to this previously, but we're going to elaborate upon it more here, is that this emphasis upon freedom is a sort of vacancy. We are vacating the capacity for the moral. Because of what is definitive about our actions is that they are freely chosen. It seems that the ground from which the justification or lack of justification for any given action, disposition, falls away or recedes. Now, the existentialist rejoinder to this concern is of a twofold nature. Now, the chief text upon which I'm relying here, it's this fantastic essay by Simone de Beauvoir, The Ethics of Ambiguity. Simone de Beauvoir, more well known for a seminal text for 20th century feminism, The Second Sex, in The Ethics of Ambiguity provides us, I believe, with an absolutely lucid, stirring account, which, to speak personally, is I think, just on the mark in terms of what is involved in becoming a genuinely, of entering into a space of genuine moral action, right? As a perhaps a worthwhile footnote, Simone de Beauvoir, in a way, is actually the most influential of the existentialists because of The Second Sex, and because of the role she played in the development of 20th century feminism, where through her, not just her account, but her account was highly influential in bringing about a recognition of the dramatic extent to which the notion of the feminine and the masculine as a corollary notion, these notions are the outcomes of creative decisions on the parts not just of the individual, but of the culture, the society, and so forth. But that is somewhat tangential. That's just by way of acknowledging a sort of subterranean manner in which existentialism has a broader import. To return to the conversation at hand about the existentialist approach toward the moral or the ethical, and its address of this concern that it leaves us, because of its emphasis on freedom, in a space bereft of justification or the absence of justification. Well, its address is as follows. It's that if you are relying on some kind of extrinsic guarantor to indicate what is ethical or moral in a given situation, whether that be some sort of divinity or a particular account of rationality, or perhaps actually just a sort of denial of the ethical question itself is even an important question. That we are just so many complicated machines, biological machines. In all of these cases, and the third is a special case, which interestingly, the existentialist, despite the secular association often coupled to that movement, the existentialist will reject that narrative about the human being very assiduously, right? But in all three of these cases, which are the major cases, what you're actually doing is you're giving away your responsibility. Because an action that is undertaken not from a space of a conscious decision, but from a reliance on the external, is a mechanical action, and as such loses its ethical quality. Now, in the event of an individual who has the capacity to make that decision, but who elects to reject that capacity and invokes in its stead some notion of extrinsic or transcendental guarantee, that person is acting effectively in bad faith. They're not dealing with the fact that they actually have the capacity to exercise freedom. And the way Simone de Beauvoir might put it, in light of her essay, is that this person is not wanting to deal with one of the fundamental ambiguities of their existence. That they have a capacity for decision, but that decision will never be perfectly moral because of the messiness of the world. Any given action will have content and consequence of, or virtually every given action, of derivatively ambiguous nature, right? So an example would be, and it just comes to mind personally, since it would be the decision to be thoroughgoing in one's vegetarianism. And some people would argue, well, that's well and good for the animals, right? But then what you're doing in principle is you are taking away revenue from the cattle industry, and this would have repercussions for the farmers, and eventually the population of cattle in the future would diminish, and what are the cattle going to say about that, right? So that's just like an example of something where you're going to make a decision, and there may well be positive aspects of that decision that are front and center, but nonetheless, it's never pure. It's never unalloyed, right? There's always some kind of admixture or possibility, and one can adduce numerous instances, right? In fact, one might even go so far as to say that it is an inescapable quality of human decision that it is imperfect. And this is, incidentally, what existentialist psychology will usually mean when it talks about the inescapability of human guilt. And the awareness of these sorts of dilemmas, this is the awareness that provokes the anxiety, the existential anxiety and existential dread, with which at one point we must all honestly wrestle if we're going to enter into our fullness as human beings. Now there is another consideration here, distinct, related, referencing what constitutes a moral action, because obviously there's a very sort of situational feel to the account of morality which is falling out of our thoughts here, right? There is this idea that, okay, well, then how does one exhibit consistency? How does one move from one decision to the next? Because it seems, in virtue of the inescapability of our liberty, that we can just take turns in terms of what we're going to do. And the problem with that approach, which can devolve into a rather gross capriciousness, is that it relies on a somewhat dishonest account of our relationship with time. The notion that all ethical decisions have an ultimately instantaneous quality to them fails to recognize that the awareness of human being is a temporal awareness. We can never reside merely within this moment. This moment inherits its meaning from its relationship with the future and with the past. And to enter into the implications of that circumstance authentically, we are to strive to create a coherent narrative that spans all three of those aspects of time, of temporality, right? So the decisions we make are not simply decisions for this instant, this second, this minute, this hour. These actually are decisions that must ultimately be correlated to a broader sense of personal and even human history. Now, that's heavy, man, right? Because it cuts off for us the possibility of being simply idiosyncratic, simply personalist. I'm using that word not with reference to the school of personalism. Apologies to that, because there is a school of thought which is closely related to existentialism, personalism, which sees the person as sort of the fundamental philosophical unit. And I have a lot of sympathy with personalism. In many ways, it's a powerful antidote to the incredibly impersonal culture that we find ourselves within at the moment. But we can't just be egoic about it. We can't be just almost sort of proximally solipsistic. Our decisions are not just for our life. They're for all human life. And there's a kind of a Kantian flavor to that tack. But I really think that the existentialists have it on the money here. I think they're getting it right in terms of the ironic consequence, in light of the connotations of radical freedom, that the acknowledgement of radical freedom really discounts our capacity to be just sort of whimsically selfish. That luxury is no longer available to us because we now have an awareness of the meanings of our actions as extending over and beyond just the finite circumscription of our life. So, I would encourage you to go ahead and seek that text out, Ethics of Ambiguity, because it goes on beyond these major points and then explores them in relief with reference to the finer-grained issues. But for purposes of introduction, I think maybe that will be adequate for the moment. Now, in the background here, and I actually have another sort of reflection to add. These surmises of existentialism, especially as it's maturing in the middle 20th century, are deeply informed by another movement, phenomenology. And I will say a bit about that in another video. And I think beyond that, we'll look at doing one more just sort of overview video where I might just append to these broad sort of thematic considerations and enumeration of more concrete, more particular existentialist philosophers and so forth. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me. I hope you're finding this useful, and talk soon.